KPBS On Demand is supported by Splatero, helping homeowners pay off debt by offering streamlined access to your home's equity with no additional monthly payments or new debt. Splatero provides a lump sum of payment in exchange for a share of your home's future value. Pre-qualification is available at splatero.com.
Welcome to another edition of listener-supported KPBS Cinema Junkie podcast. I'm Beth Accomando. All right, in case you can't tell, I love horror films, and I make no secret about how I think the genre lends itself to exploring serious issues while still delivering thrills and chills. One subgenre that merits attention is queer horror. Queer horror is not anything new. Many would point to James Whale's 1931 Frankenstein and his 1935 Bride of Frankenstein as memorable early examples. But while Whale was openly gay, his characters were not. So for this podcast, I want to focus on some more recent examples of openly gay horror films that use genre tropes to make us rethink stereotypes and to make us consider social issues from a radically different perspective. And that perspective is one that these new filmmakers prefer to label as queer, says Canadian filmmaker Daniel Sterlin Altman.
I think at this stage, it makes sense for a film to be classified as queer because it isn't part of mainstream. You can't just say that it isn't queer just because you want it to blend in with the rest. I haven't seen the other films, but I can imagine that queer horror does take on a different sort of lens than typical horror would be, because I have an understanding that horror itself is sort of charged sexually a lot of the time. So I can only imagine that sort of especially the male eye over mainstream horror compared to a more queer lens would have a different effect.
He also likes the history of the word.
Queer, having been, before I was alive, having been like sort of a dirty word, so it'd be exciting to reclaim it. And I feel like that sort of, it still maybe has that dirty element that makes it still exciting.
So queer horror today is coming from openly gay filmmakers who choose to do genre films and aren't afraid of making their gay characters serial killers, demons, or monsters, because there's a much larger pool of gay characters out there in the mainstream media to make it easier for some of those characters to be less than perfect. And being able to explore a greater range of characters through the genre of horror opens up exciting creative and artistic opportunities. This year, FilmOut San Diego hosts its first ever block of gay horror shorts called Fright Out. That's something programmer Michael McQuiggan is thrilled to be doing. He's a devoted fan of horror, and every year he tries to bring genre films to the festival. Over his 13 years with FilmOut, he's programmed the first gay slasher film, Hellbent, brought LGBT monsters to town with Bite Marks and ZMD, Zombies of Mass Destruction, and showcased disturbingly dark dramas like Drown and Downriver. Having attended FilmOut for the past 2 decades has allowed me to see a wide array of queer horror. So when I was asked to co-sponsor this year's horror block with the chance to interview all of the directors, I jumped at the opportunity. Then, when one of the young filmmakers, Jesse Klein, mentioned the impact of Paul Etheridge-Oudt's 2004 film Hellbent, I decided it was time to track down that director and find out what it was like to make a film that was promoted as the first gay slasher film. For this podcast, I speak with Michael McQuiggan about programming gay horror, and then with Paul Etheridge-Oudts about making Hellbent as his first feature film and how that affected his career. And finally, with a quartet of young filmmakers about what queer horror means to them. Before I begin my interview with FilmOut programmer Michael McQuiggan, let's hear a little of the trailer for the landmark gay slasher film Hellbent, which McQuiggan programmed his first year at the festival.
This is where it happened. 2 guys were murdered on this spot.
Their heads were cut off so cleanly. The tubes? They weren't crushed at all. They were wide open.
Michael, you're a big fan of horror, and I remember very distinctly back in 2004, you programmed Hellbent. So tell me about finding that film and why you felt it was important to screen it.
I loved Hellbent. Back in 2004, I think that There was a little bit of buzz on the LGBT film festival circuit because they were billing Hellbent as the first gay slasher film. So of course my radar went right up. So I kind of wanted to just experiment with a few different types of genres, and Hellbent kicked some ass for us. I mean, we did extremely well with that title. There really haven't been many gay slasher films that have been showcasing on any of the festival circuits that I've known. Maybe there's a few titles here and there, but they're not slasher films. They maybe fall into the thriller genre, but nothing like that film. I'm proud that we screened that back in 2004, and actually, it might be coming back to FilmOut sooner than later, we're hoping. So more on that to follow.
Now, it did well in terms of selling tickets. How was the audience response after they saw it? Were they appreciative of it, or were there some people who were feeling that it may depict gays in a negative light?
I don't think it depicted gays in a negative light. I think the movie was so high energy that people were really excited after it ended because it was fun. And, to see a film like that, with 300 people, it gets your adrenaline pumping. So I didn't have any negative feedback from any audience members, from the community, from anybody that I can recall at this point. No, it did really well. We were excited. It was exciting. It was thrilling. So now I'm proud that we screened that.
That was back in 2004. You have made a commitment to showing films that are dark and some that are horror. But this year is going to be the first year that you actually have a block of horror shorts. Is this something that it's just taken time before you had enough films to choose from to create a horror block?
It was always on the back burner of my mind to try something like this, but that we didn't have many genre films that were submitted to us through FilmOut. And we have 900 titles submitted last year, and then maybe you would get a handful of horror titles. But this year we got a handful that I thought to myself, these are all worthy titles. I don't want to just discard these and not screen these because they're horror. I know there's an audience for it here in San Diego. I decided to just take a chance and do an LGBT horror block on Saturday night at 10 o'clock. And I selected, with Jeff Howell, my lead programmer, 5 titles, which I think audiences will enjoy. I mean, they're roller coaster rides. They're exciting. They're thrilling. You'll jump. You'll laugh. It's a good time. So I'm hoping, maybe ask me the same question in a few weeks after we see how the screening goes. But if there are 100 people, 150 people that show up for this horror track, that I'll consider that a success. So I'm excited. So and for people who are like, oh, it's horror, I don't really want to, I don't want to, I can't go down that route. Just give it a chance. They're all quality films. The 2 of the filmmakers are going to be there, and it's if you're kind of spooked to see this kind of a genre, the best place to see it is with other people in a packed house. So then you can go out and have a drink after.
And do you think we've come to a point where there is something that can be considered a subgenre of either gay or queer horror? And is that something that you think labeling it that way is a good thing?
No,
or
I think that's a great thing. Honestly, I would love to do an LGBT horror festival that just kind of showcases that type of work. Maybe this will encourage filmmakers to make a 10 or 15-minute short film or to make a feature film. Go for it. You have more of a chance of getting something original and offbeat into any festival if it's not a cookie cutter. So, I encourage filmmakers, make these genre films. You have more of a chance of getting selected for film festivals if your art is original.
And what I noticed about this particular group of short films was that it seemed to take a lot of stereotypes that exist and turn them on their ear through horror. So some of the gay characters seem to be victims initially and turn around to be the thing that's most scary in the film, or where you're thinking that, the story is about someone being gay, but it turns out that maybe it's not about being gay so much as it's about being a serial killer. So
exactly. I mean, there are some stereotypes in some of these short films, but they flip it over. It's not, I think with at least 3 of the films, they kind of you think it's going somewhere, and then it just takes a wrong turn, and you're like, Oh, I get it now. But no, I mean, what, just because you're LGBT, you can't be a serial killer or a cannibal? I mean, come on, they're all over the place. So let's get down. It's like back in 1980 when Dressed to Kill and Cruising and Windows came out, and people were like, blah, 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 blah. I don't agree with that at all. I was like, you know what? LGBT people can be killers, can be murderers, can be rapists, can be cannibals. We're all, it's across the board. It's not just because you're LGBT, you can't be any of those things. It happens.
Well, do you think we've come to a point now where just the fact that with more representation, it seems like you can have more diversity, so a single character doesn't have to carry the weight of being the only gay character in a film?
You know what would have been great for the upcoming remake of Murder on the Orient Express? Make that an all-gay cast. Make the whole cast gay characters. Try something like that. Flip it. Make it fun. Make it exciting. Make it original. Make it different. Step up your game.
McQuiggan will be highlighting a group of young filmmakers who have done just that on June 10th with a block of queer horror shorts. But to lay the groundwork for what those filmmakers are doing now, let me first have Paul Etheridge Oots provide some background on the making of what was billed as the first gay slasher film, Hellbent.
The one night of the year, Halloween, when you get to indulge your most twisted fantasies.
Flaming penis?
You got 3 right here.
One swallow, you're hooked.
Life is meant for living.
I'm not a slasher fan, or I wasn't growing up, so that was the furthest type of film I wanted to make. But I was working with a production company and had for a couple of years as a post supervisor and, various things around the office, helping the films get made. And I was walking down the hallway one day, and our head producer jumped out and dragged me into a pitch session. And there were 2 money guys who wanted to make a gay horror film. They said, "What do you got?" We bonded over a couple of films from the 1960s that we're both familiar with, Black Orpheus being chief among them. And they really liked that idea of a killer at some kind of crazy Halloween festival. Then they sent me off to write the script, and I struggled with that thing. I'd never written a script before.
When you were working on that, did you feel that you were breaking new ground or doing anything that was different from what had been done before?
What I was chiefly aware of is that in slasher films, the victims, the young people, are punished for having sex. And, that's kind of as part of the titillation. And I felt very strongly that should not be something I drag into Hellbent. And I danced a lot around that. So that was really my main focus. I didn't want to demonize gay sex or have people, in the audience cheering because, sexually active guys were being killed. In this day and age, had I to do it again, I probably would have changed it up. And, I think it's more permissible to, more acceptable for gay guys to be seen having sex, whereas at the time, not so much.
And this was made in 2004. So what kind of was the industry like in terms of someone wanting to make a gay slasher film like this? I mean, you said you had a company that wanted to make it, but was this something that was considered a risky gamble or something?
Definitely. Yeah, definitely. This was before the Red camera came out, so making a film like this was very low budget and technically challenging to make because the technical resources just weren't there yet. Now with the Red camera, has a great picture and it's accessible to everybody. It just wasn't that way at the time. So, Hellbent had a tiny budget. I'm not even really sure what the final is, but it's, $500,000 or less. The producers were, straight, white men. Honestly, I don't know why they wanted to make something gay. They never told me that, but they were very sensitive about, the subject matter. I had to make revisions to the scripts to make sure that nothing was going to be ruffled in the audience. It's going to, it was challenging. And also getting actors. that was a challenge.
The other thing that seems challenging, and this seems to be the case whenever you're dealing with a group of people who are underrepresented in the mainstream media, is you get a pushback, because I've seen this with women who do horror and want to depict like a female killer or a female serial killer. And the pushback is, oh, you should be ashamed of yourself for not depicting women in a better light. And your killer, if I remember, it's been over a decade since I saw your film, but if I remember right, it's like the sexual identity of the killer or his sexual orientation was not entirely clear. And there was this sense of you weren't sure if he was homophobic or if he was deliberately targeting gays. So I'm just curious if you had any kind of pushback or feeling that you met with criticism for like, hey, you shouldn't be depicting gays in any kind of a negative light.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, there's plenty of criticism all over the board. It wasn't gay enough. It was too gay. It was, how dare you, give the enemy any sort of fodder to use against us, all of that. That's expected, I guess. I'm trying to remember if there's anything really specific. It wasn't very upsetting. I mean, there were plenty of legitimate complaints, too. But yes, absolutely.
FilmOut is going to be showing a collection of short horror films in their first gay horror block. And what's interesting is that a number of those have the gay characters as the killer or as the character that is meant to be scary or threatening, and not in a negative light. I mean, the killers are kind of like the main characters that you are sympathetic to. And
they're justified in their killings.
It's an interesting array. Some of them are comedies. There's one that deals with a comedy that's a serial killer. And the opening scene, this is the filmmaker who actually mentioned your film as something he had seen and had stuck in his mind. But it opens with a therapy session where the guy's confessing that he's a serial killer, and he's talking about the burden this is, and you find out by the end that what he's really in therapy for is to get rid of the gay demon. These horror films seem to be taking kind of an interesting look at gay issues in the sense of they're not afraid to depict characters who might not be role models, and they also seem to be taking an interesting way of pushing back at a lot of the stereotypes and prejudices that they may be experiencing as filmmakers or as people. So horror is always an interesting genre, I feel, for dealing with kind of social issues. And
absolutely. It gives you a lot of leeway to really push some boundaries. I think that's awesome that the filmmakers are feeling confident in portraying their gay characters that way. Like I said, if I were to do Hellbent again now, I would approach it differently. At the time, so many of the gay representations in horror films were of killers. And because they were psychotic or twisted or, somehow broken, and I was very sensitive about that. And that's great that they're, these new filmmakers are able to let us be more nuanced, I guess, inhabit more of the roles. And I'm very curious about it.
Well, I've always felt too that with underrepresented groups that for me, like for seeing women characters on screen, the goal for me has never been like, oh, there should be more positive representations. I always felt like there should just be more representations so you can have variety and not feel that because there's only one film with a female director or one film with a strong female character, like that one has the burden of...
Yeah. Oh, I agree. I agree with that. That, if you're sort of the only one, then all eyes turn to, the characters that you're creating, and those have to, represent everybody. There aren't enough voices.
Did you look to any other films? Did you feel any other films were an influence on you when you were making Hellbent?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I watched Halloween a lot, partly because one of my producers was heavily involved in the original Halloween. So I know that was sort of playing up to what he was familiar and comfortable with, especially since that had made some money. I also looked at films like, just to help influence my visual style, films like the original Invaders from Mars, because I knew I wasn't going to have a lot of money, but I wanted to have a look. Let's see, what else did I watch a lot of? Probably a lot of Brian De Palma.
It's Hollywood. It's West Hollywood during Halloween, which is, you mentioned that you wanted it to be during some big, crazy event.
Yeah. We chose the West Hollywood Festival probably in the first meeting, in that first pitch session. The idea was there was this, people in masks and costumes, and nobody knew who the killer was. It was going to be very colorful and a lot of pageantry, that kind of thing. In part to help separate it from the Halloween series and a lot of the films that are set in Halloween. We wanted to really embrace the dressing up and the kind of the bacchanal elements. And we shot for 2 years at the actual West Hollywood parade, which was interesting.
I was going to say, how difficult was that to do?
It was very challenging. In part, there's the technical stuff, you having to get photo releases from people that you're filming and avoiding costumes that are too topical. We shot right after 9/11 on our first, that's before we even had a script. We just went out and shot a bunch of footage, and of course we had to avoid anything that pinpointed 9/11 first responders or whatever. But also there's the elements of, everyone in the crew is getting drunk, everyone in the crowd is getting drunk, lots of drag queens staggering up to the cameras and vomiting. That kind of thing. A lot of good B-roll there.
How did you decide on the direction that you did want to take that script and the story you did want to tell?
That was a real process. Like I mentioned before, I wasn't a fan of slasher films. I'm actually made pretty queasy by people getting killed, which is funny because I love horror. Initially I was like, there will be no blood in my movie. Of course, it's actually pretty bloody. And I wrote a number of versions of Hellbent before it became anything like what it is. And they were kind of awful and gruesome, and I was so unsettled by them. A lot of cannibalism and, the handsome guy who's the gay killer who was hot and kept, drilled into people's heads, and what's that fellow's name?
Was it Jeffrey Dahmer?
Jeffrey Dahmer, yeah, just those sorts of elements. I'm like, I can't live with this story for as long as I need to make a movie. My kind of kinder, gentler sensibility started taking over, and I'm like, you know what, this is going to be a gay romance. They're just going to have this killer obstacle. So that's kind of how I focused on it. And then once I got into it and kind of broke the ground on the story that is Hellbent, I started embracing the killer more and the violence, and understood how fun it could be. It was definitely an evolution for me.
Describe your killer, because he is masked, and so describe how you wanted him to come across in the film and look.
I wanted him to be very sexy and appealing and eye-catching. We actually cast an Abercrombie Fitch model in that role. I think that the devil is just such a distinctive silhouette. That's what I focused on. I knew I would be backlighting him a lot, and the horns were threatening yet still kind of sensual. That I liked that image. I did put him in shoes that had different size heels so that he would walk with a kind of a funny crookedness. But I cut around that pretty much because it just did not work. He looked really pretty ridiculous when he was moving around. That's something that you kind of discover on set. But I did want his sexuality to be nebulous. Like, you weren't entirely sure what was motivating him. My thought was that this was a celebration for him as well. This was his bacchanal, his way of expressing it, and everybody was fair game. The this quartet of guys just happened to be the ones to attract his attention because of their encounter in the park. And then it became, the game of stalking. I never saw him as like an angry guy, just as someone who has a different sort of lust.
And he didn't really have the kind of boogeyman supernatural elements.
Not quite, no. I mean, he is still alive at the end after being shot in the head. So there's that bit, but it wasn't. I never thought of him as being something supernatural.
And do you remember how the film was greeted by gay audiences? Was it embraced by them, or?
Some, yeah. I think people had fun. I don't know. To be honest, my relationship with the film at that point, it's my first film, and I had a lot of emotional rawness at that point. So I'm trying to remember how other people reacted to it. I definitely still get people writing fan mail or coming up to me in bars saying, "Oh my God, I loved your movie. I watch it every year. We make it a ritual," and I definitely appreciate that. There were plenty of, gay crowds or people in the gay crowds who did not respond well to it. But there you go. I guess it's just, that's just how it goes.
And do you feel that making that as your first film, did that kind of color or change, do you feel, the way your career went or how you ended up in the industry?
Yeah, I do. I'm very proud of it. It's the most personal thing I've created. There's a lot of me wrapped up in that, a lot of my own experience. And I'm, grateful for the opportunity, all of that. I do feel that what I expected to get out of the film never materialized. It was very hard for me to get another directing job after that, or, that's mainstream, agents and all of that. I didn't really know what to do with it. It was rough. It wasn't shot on film, and the subject matter was still a little taboo. So yeah, I think it did. It did make it a little rockier right after the release than I had anticipated. I thought I was going to get shot out of a cannon, and no.
Well, horror as a genre by itself I always think it's kind of a tricky genre because in some ways it's easy to make a horror film and people expect it to do well at the box office and it can get you some notoriety, but a lot of people don't want to stay in the genre, and then some people feel like they get tainted by it.
Mm-hmm.
I love the genre, and I really admire the filmmakers like David Cronenberg and Clive Barker, filmmakers who stay in the genre and expand it.
I love horror, and I do not regret. I still play around in it. I still hope to make more horror films. There was a whole decade where we were kind of stuck in the Saw and the torture porn and all of that. I don't respond to that at all. I don't think it has a thought in its head. But, the Cronenbergs, I don't know that that's necessarily scary stuff, but it is horror commentary, I guess, and I love that. I like the smart, challenging types of horror and the visuals that you can put with it, and the kinds of stories you can tell that can be so outlandish and yet disturbing and moving in ways you don't expect. I love that. So I don't regret doing horror at all.
Yeah, I had a chance to interview Cronenberg, and what he...
Lucky.
Well, and the thing that he said that always struck me, because I think his films are in the horror genre. They're not conventional horror by any means. And what he gets to is far more disturbing than what most mainstream horror does. But the comment he made, he says, "I'm not interested in making comfortable cinema."
Mm-hmm.
And that seems to sum up his films. It's like they're disquieting and they're disturbing and they're uncomfortable, and they get to something that's really kind of core to what horror is about.
You don't even know that's there in you. Love that.
What other horror filmmakers do you admire or do you like?
Well, like I mentioned before, Brian De Palma. I grew up with De Palma. My mother is a huge Brian De Palma fan. I was scared to death of Texas Chainsaw Massacre, even seeing it. I saw like the first 3 minutes of it and turned it off, and I couldn't watch it, for probably 15 years. I have grown to appreciate that movie quite a lot. I actually was at a friend's house on Valentine's Day several years ago, and Tobe Hooper showed up to this party of like 14 gay guys with a new print of Texas Chainsaw Massacre and screened it for us. But what I remember vividly at the beginning of it, he said, I shot this to be a comedy. And I watched it as though it were a comedy, and it completely changed my experience. I loved it. It was so much fun. Alien is my favorite horror film. I had to go into therapy after seeing that movie. There's some recent horror films that I've appreciated. It Follows. I really enjoyed The Babadook. But I don't know that those directors have, enough under their belts to say, this is a horror film director. But there you go.
So it's a genre that you would like to return to. Do you have any concrete ideas? Would you?
Mainly, I have been in my head. Yes, I do have one concrete idea that I've been fleshing out for, I don't know, a couple of years. I was asked to do it like a gay horror comic book at one point, and I came up with something that has never left me, and I've been retooling that. Usually when I think about horror, I think of it in the shorts form, because there is something very specific that I want to address. Yeah, I've got some ideas for that too, but I'm not out there pitching horror currently. I've been trying to do more easier to sell thriller stuff.
You mentioned that if you were making Hellbent now, it would be a different film.
Yeah.
What kind of things would you change if you were to make it? If somebody came to you and said, let's do a remake of Hellbent tomorrow, what kind of things, how would you kind of re-envision it for today?
I would develop the killer more, not necessarily give him a backstory and a horrible scene with his mother or anything like that, but one of the complaints I heard most frequently was, we don't really understand anything about the killer. So I don't ever want us to know his name or anything, but I would develop him more so that you sort of understood his motivations. Hellbent was conceived as being more than one film, at least in my mind, and we talked about doing a sequel for a while. But and so I think I made the rookie mistake of holding on to too much to reveal in the second film, and then of course the second film never came. I'd also make it more sexual. I wouldn't shy away from that. I think that now that we are, the apps, the dating apps, and that aspect of, anonymous meeting, and that is sort of permeates our gay culture, I would involve that more. The willingness to be riskier. We didn't have that when I made Hellbent. We didn't even have iPhones yet. So, I think that would be an interesting element to bring in. Talking about sex again, where PrEP has now freed us from some concerns, but, there are other things that we choose to not look at when we're having sex with strangers. I'd probably incorporate a lot more of that. I'd be more willing to point to some of our darker impulses than I was when I wrote Hellbent. Mm-hmm. And I wanted us to all be angels.
Do you think that there are enough films or filmmakers at this point to have kind of a subgenre of gay horror films?
I go back and forth on what is gay horror. I remember being asked a lot when Hellbent came out, what did I think about gay horror? And when I was writing it, I wasn't certain that there was gay horror, because everything that was horrifying and terrible to gays was also to straight people. Being chased, being hacked up, watching your lover get killed. That's all terrible stuff. But now I think that it's for me, it's more queer horror. It takes it out of sexual necessarily, about being homosexual or lesbian or whatnot, and just turns it into being somehow radically different from what you expect of yourself or what your peers are or what other people expect of you. That's what I think of when I think of gay horror now. Are there enough people to do it? I don't know. You tell me.
There's definitely more than there has been, so that's
Good.
Promising.
Yeah. I mean, I'm glad that filmmakers have access to, making these things. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I would love to see what that looks like, because I wrestle with those questions. What is the gay horror, the queer horror? What does that mean to people now?
Well, and I've seen a few films made by gay filmmakers where it feels like on a certain level there's an anger that they have against a lot of the prejudice that they've dealt with, and they use the horror genre to like depict a character who initially seems like maybe a stereotypical weak gay character, a stereotype by like a white male straight guy. And that character turns on those people and proves to be the dangerous one. You think like these redneck guys who were picking on him are the ones that are dangerous. And then there's a turn, and it's suddenly like, oh, no, the guy you're picking on is actually a demon, and he's going to devour you. And so next time you think about, stereotyping us like that, think twice, kind of. So it seems like horror is taking is offering some interesting opportunities to kind of turn stereotypes around and say like we're saying like instead of the gay character being the victim or being the one that's put through a lot, that character turns around to be the one that is the strong one.
What we fantasize about when we're in high school, right? And we're feeling pushed into the corner, like, well, only I were the superhero or the one to watch out for. I totally understand that impulse. And that's what the shorts are.
There's one
you're seeing expressed.
Yeah, there was one short, and I'm on a selection committee for a horror film festival here in San Diego, Horrible Imaginings. So
look at you.
I do love the genre. I've always felt it's a bit maligned, and
yeah, it's a freeing genre.
And it's funny because working on a horror film festival, I have people tell me all the time, like, oh, I'm not really into horror. And I said, I think you'd be really surprised by how broad that genre is. And like, you can't, saying you don't like horror is, saying you just don't like movies, because there's a really...
Well, it is, essentially it's all metaphor. Mm-hmm. It's poetic. That's what I loved about it.
You mentioned films like It Follows and The Babadook. Are those kind of the recent examples of the genre that you look to as kind of hopeful for what the future of the genre is?
Yeah, I do. There's part of me that is just relieved that we're moving away from, the torture porn, which I just couldn't stomach horror for a long time. And I felt like it was, so cynical. Whereas, the Babadook and It Follows, probably the Babadook more, they were playing with ideas, and the situations were simply horrifying. Plus the acting was really good in both of those, I thought. We're moving into areas that felt really types of fears that were relatable and personal. I don't get very fearful on these kind of cataclysmic movies. It's just too big to comprehend the world, falling into the sun or whatnot. Get Out, too. I loved Get Out. That was another one where, it's not terrifying. I don't necessarily need to be terrified, but I was so uncomfortable having been at those parties thinking, oh, God, we're awful. And just how clever it was.
Yes. Well, thank you very much, and thank you for making Hellbent and kind of changing that horror landscape just a little bit.
Well, you are very welcome. Great talking with you.
That was Paul Etheridge-Oots, director of Hellbent. Now let's chat a little with some young filmmakers serving up new examples of queer horror. Let's begin with Jesse Klein, director of the short film Demons. He explains where the idea for his film came from.
So it started probably like 2 years ago. Script is pretty much straight out of a dream, actually, that I had. I think I've been watching, like, too much news, and I've just seen too many, like, anti-gay protests out there, and it kind of, like, resonated with me a lot. So I think the dream world just had something to say about it. That's how it came about.
So just so people have a little bit of a sense of what your film is, I'm going to play the opening scene, which begins in a therapy session.
Okay. Where do I start? Well, I'm Matt. I enjoy sports, and I also enjoy reading. I enjoy drinking every now and then. I'm gay. Oh, and I kill people. I've never actually admitted that out loud before. My parents would literally murder me if they found out. I guess I just want to be normal.
Matt, thank you for sharing. I see that was really hard for you to admit, but I'm gonna do everything in my power to help cure you.
Your kind of choice as to how to tackle this subject was through humor and through horror. What led you to kind of choose that route to respond to the feelings you were having about seeing all these anti-gay protests on TV?
I guess my main goal of this film was to try to bring like a non-LGBT person into the driver's seat and to create a kind of relatable character and to just create like a very extreme world that he was put in. But I wanted to make it very like over the top so the person really gets like kind of the LGBT experience, like living in a world where sometimes it's perceived that a lot of people are against you and where you might not be doing, you can't help kind of everyone's inner demons are kind of out there, and your inner demons are people tend to think that's like the worst thing, out there. But yeah, I don't know. I just wanted to show it in a different light.
Well, and also kind of a little bit of the twist is you have this therapy session and you're thinking that maybe it's about being a serial killer as the problem, but it's actually he seems more afraid to admit that he's gay than that he's a serial killer.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Yeah, I guess, going back to what inspired me for the short, just watching these LGBT protests, people protesting, don't ask, don't tell, marriage equality, like all those things with such venom, like it's like the worst thing, like it's in the 10 Commandments, like I must protest this, like this is like equality is just too much for me, So just kind of going back to that therapy scene, just having them talk about like drugs, like it's nothing, like it doesn't affect anyone, or murdering people, it's whatever, to each their own. But being gay is just like, oh my gosh, like you are hurting everyone with who you choose to kiss sometimes. So.
And is this your first horror, or have you been working in the genre before?
I've done a couple short horror films. Yeah, it's my favorite genre, so definitely it will be more for me in that genre.
And what is it about the horror genre that appeals to you?
I just love how kind of over the top you can be with your message. It's definitely not like a subtle genre. I love, specifically, I have one scene that's kind of just like my Tarantino scene where the guy just goes on like a killing spree and there's blood everywhere. And I just love how artistic it can be and also have like such like a strong message to it that kind of like hits you over the head, or it could be like in a very subtle way. But you just walk away with horror films just kind of like thinking about it for a while. And that's what I hope to do with my short film.
It seems like it's taken a little while for there to be like a good core group of gay horror films. The festival that we have here, the programmer loves horror movies, and I remember he programmed one of the first gay horror slasher films, Hellbent, I think it was.
Yeah, that's the only one I know about.
Back when that came out, and it seems like it's a genre that hasn't been, used that much by LGBT filmmakers. And I was just curious if you felt there was a trend towards that now, or is there a fact that there are more LGBT films out there now, so it feels like filmmakers are more willing to kind of go into genre filmmaking?
Yeah, that's so funny you mentioned Hellbent, 'cause that's literally like the only gay feature-length horror film that I've ever seen. Horror. That's like our only represented film, and that's actually what inspired me to kind of go down that path. There's definitely a lot more LGBT content out there, which is awesome. A lot more film festivals catered towards LGBT people. FilmOut's amazing. That even had this category. I think I just learned from another interview that it was the first time ever that they had like this horror category for gay content, which is amazing. Hellbent's still the only feature-length horror film LGBT that I know about.
You mentioned Hellbent was a bit of an influence on you. Are there other films or filmmakers that kind of influenced you in terms of getting into this career?
Oh, yeah, definitely. So I love Sam Raimi, the Evil Dead series, Drag Me to Hell, and the Scream series, Wes Craven. Those are probably the main two horror series. I just love how they approach horror with that comedy aspect as well, and they have that over-the-top fun quality, like an excess of blood in Evil Dead, and that slasher, just like mystery quality that's also, told with a sense of humor and cheeky quality. Like they make fun of like the horror rules and everything like that. Yeah, they don't take themselves too serious, I guess, and they have like a very strong message to say. So those are probably my two main influences. And
is your goal eventually to move into feature films?
Yeah, my next one I'm working on slowly right now. I'm not a writer, so it's going to take me a while, but I'm hoping to create another horror feature-length film out there. But yeah, my next film is definitely going to be a feature. I think it's going to be a challenge, but it's going to be fun.
And you're going to stay in the horror genre?
Oh yeah, it's going to be another horror pseudo-comedy, but more horror thriller, I guess.
That was Jesse Klein, whose short film Demons is being showcased in FilmOut's first ever horror block, Fright Out. Also showcased in that block is Dominic Haxton's Tonight It's You. Here he explains what his film is about.
My film is about a guy who meets up with another guy via a online hookup app like Grindr, and he goes to the guy's place, which is in the kind of the mountains in a very rural area, and a series of very strange things happen and lead him into a situation where his life is at risk. And I don't want to give too much away, but it's basically about what could happen when you meet a stranger online.
Okay. Why don't we just go inside then?
My parents are sleeping.
All right. What's up?
I'm Hunter.
CJ. You don't really look like your picture.
No.
Yeah, I know.
Well, it's me.
Okay. I believe you. For now.
So how do you feel about your film being part of FilmOut's first ever gay horror block?
I think it's great. I think gay horror is a huge subgenre that is only growing, and there's a huge interest in horror films from LGBT audiences. More recently, we're seeing more examples of just overtly queer horror films, whereas before, I think it was more coded. Like when you had James Whale, Frankenstein films, and goes back to Interview with a Vampire. But I think a lot of the LGBT film festivals are now having horror short programs, and they're very popular too. So I think it's definitely a good thing.
And for you personally, what attracts you to working in the horror genre?
I think that horror is one of the remaining types of movies that people are still going to see in the theater, next to like the superhero action movies. And I think it's a way as an independent filmmaker to make something with a certain, I guess, transgressive viewpoint where you can have it kind of as like a subtle theme throughout, or like the meaning behind it, but also play on a certain level to a mainstream audience, as long as it's scary and it has a lot of tone and atmosphere to it. Like some of the greatest horror films, it can be appreciated on multiple levels, like The Shining and The Exorcist, and more recent ones like It Follows and The Babadook and Goodnight Mommy and The Witch.
And do you think there's something in particular about the horror genre that you find appealing to deal with gay themes or issues?
Well, I think that growing up gay, you identify with being the other, with being alienated, with being kind of the outcast. So, and that's definitely a common theme in horror films. It's the monsters and the villains usually are that character. So we identify to a certain extent to horror films because of that. I don't know if you've seen my film, but it's like the character who you think is being victimized is actually the one that you should be afraid of. And it was my goal to kind of subvert that expectation, and I think it's important too that we don't, you have these characters who aren't just the ones who are getting, at least they have power, and even if it's a dark power, they're not the ones who are being defeated.
I'm wondering if you get any pushback in the sense of if you're doing horror, like, wait a minute, maybe you shouldn't be depicting gay characters in a light that could be construed as negative.
Yeah, I see where that comes from, because anytime when you have a certain group that's underrepresented in film and media, when you do see a representation of them, and it is in a negative way, or they're depicted as the villain or the monster, then you get a huge, backlash. Like you saw it with a lot of films like Silence of the Lambs, where the serial killer was transgender, and Basic Instinct, when the girlfriend who was lesbian and she ends up getting killed. And I don't think either of those films and, a lot of other films are at fault for that. I think it's just how people react to things when they don't see them often. And I think the more representations of queer characters, the less, I guess, reactive people will be to seeing them as villains. And I think it's important, too, that we have stories that, where queer characters can be the villain and they can be the victims, and it's not viewed as it's not viewed as a negative thing, like the filmmaker is sending a negative message, because, especially in the case for my film, because I have seen a lot of comments on YouTube and stuff about people saying, oh, the guy turns out to be a demon, so I was somehow associating homosexuality with that. But I think it's a stretch, and I think, you look at I've made other LGBT films, and I'm gay, so it just doesn't really make sense to leap to that conclusion. And I think that it's a story where the characters just happen to be gay. It's not like I could have made one of the characters a woman, and it could have just been a heterosexual hookup, and no one would have said anything. But the fact that they're both, gay men and living in a, small rural community, people can make conclusions about that.
As you mentioned, when the characters are underrepresented in the mainstream media, since there are so few of them, each of those tends to carry more weight, whether it's fair to that character or not.
Yeah. But like I said, if you look at it as just a horror film where the characters happen to be gay, then you don't make those conclusions. It's like, I think nowadays when you're seeing films like Moonlight win Best Picture and we have gay, it's not like it was before. I think we can start moving beyond kind of these identity politics of being so PC about everything in terms of these types of representations. Because I think, why shouldn't we have characters like this? I think it's more interesting.
Definitely. Well, and your film also brings up kind of different layers of horror, because there are also in the film these kind of religious right people who are attempting some sort of exorcism, and that kind of extreme religious perspective has its own kind of horror to it.
Yeah. Well, and that's kind of something that I was playing with, and I wanted to have the audience expect the story to go a certain way. Like I said, this character, he's being victimized by these fanatical fundamentalist Christians who are, who the audience think is probably performing a gay exorcism, because you think, oh, the dad just caught him hooking up, or at least that's what we think, and he's calling the preacher, and then they're going to do to get the gay out of him. But then it's like, no, he actually is possessed by a demon, and they're just doing a normal exorcism, and he was being kept in a house because he was possessed, and the father was just angry that he was going out into the shed, and he probably didn't know what he was doing in the shed.
And is there also kind of touching on a horror element of the whole meetup scene where, you're hooking up with a total stranger, and like that has a whole series of kind of horror tropes associated with it, because it's like you don't know who these people are. And
and also playing with the idea that there's some transference of energy there. Like the sex scene I shot in a surreal way, because that is the scene where the character Hunter kind of transferring the demon to CJ. And that's why towards the end of the film, you see him, when he's showering, trying to scrub himself clean, you see his eyes are white. And then at the end, you see that Hunter has come back for him to kind of collect his soul in a way.
And do you think that you talked about that there is this kind of a new subgenre of gay horror, and do you feel that it's kind of reaching a point of where it's reaching a critical mass where there are a lot more being made, and that there's a trend towards it?
Well, there's not a lot of feature gay horror films. There's a lot of short ones that I've seen, and like I said, most of the LGBT film festivals have the horror program. But I think, and I'm working on a gay horror feature right now, so I think there's definitely, the audience for it. I just think more filmmakers need to venture into that unexplored subgenre.
Are there any films that you remember influencing you that you felt had elements of, or that had gay characters that were horror films?
I think, and it's in a kind of a different way, but movies like Whatever Happened to Baby Jane and Mommy Dearest, and the characters aren't gay, but they're definitely queer. That makes sense. Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, you have these two women who they're very kind of over the top and campy, and they've been outcasts and they just live in their house. And as a gay kid growing up and seeing these, there's something that speaks to me in that. I'm trying to think of other films. Well, definitely Psycho. Anthony Perkins' Psycho, I would say, was a queer character, and Hannibal Lecter in Silence of the Lambs. But yeah, for sure, Whatever Happened to Baby Jane.
Well, and that's a brilliant film on so many levels.
Yeah, and Mommy Dearest too. Faye Dunaway's performance was definitely horrific. And the wire coat hanger scene, that gave me nightmares.
And is horror a genre that you want to stay working in?
Definitely. I'm working on a series right now, and a queer horror anthology series. And I'm also adapting a novella. It's a young adult novella that's queer horror. So.
Because I would be curious to talk to you again after you see all the films to see.
Yeah, I've actually seen a lot of them already from Peyote, the film that's similar to mine in my program. But there's some really weird similar. We use the same moon, stock footage moon shot. I mean, our films start out almost identically. like the characters are watching horror movies while they're texting on Grindr. Yeah, I mean, it's a trope. It's not like we're the first ones to do that. But I think it's also interesting, like, when you talk about queer horror films and what both my film and his film have in common is merging sex and horror, like, and it's an interest. I mean, you see it a lot in other, horror films, but like, I think when it comes with, gay LGBT films, we can do it without having it labeled as misogynist or having it labeled as, because it's just two men in a situation as opposed to a man killing a woman or putting a woman in. Like, if my film was a man and a woman meeting up, there would be a certain dynamic I'd have to be very cautious of, not making it seem like, you know what I'm saying? Like, it's a completely different thing. Like, when a woman is going into an unsafe situation because a man can, overpower, it's like a different dynamic. Whereas if it's two men, I mean, there still can be that situation, but I feel like it doesn't have that, like, I don't know how to articulate it, but I think you get what I mean.
No, I think that's completely accurate, because I think that does take on those gender roles come into play in a different way.
And a film can easily be labeled as misogynist or sexist or whatever. And if you see a woman being like overpowered in a situation like that, or like attacked or violated in any way, but I think with two men, we don't have to worry about that.
Well, I look forward to seeing you at the FilmOut Festival, and I appreciate you making some time to talk about your film.
Yeah, thank you so much.
That was Dominic Haxton, director of Tonight It's You. Blake Mawson's Piotr 495 presents a similar starting point with a young man seeking a hookup online. I asked him how he felt about having his film showcased in FilmOut's first ever queer horror block, Fright Out.
It feels great. I think that horror and genre film in general has always had a very underlying current with queerness and, the idea of feeling like an outsider. And I think as a gay person, there is something very relatable to a lot of the characters in horror. And I think that from what I've seen from all the other horror blocks that have been in queer festivals around the country, they're always sold out and hugely popular. So there's definitely something there that connects.
Do you think that gay horror is something that has been kind of coming into its own recently, or is it something that has been a long time kind of in the making?
It's been a long time in the making for sure. I mean, there's a lot of films from the 80s, Nightmare on Elm Street 2 in particular, which was just so gay, and you watch it now and it's just like, it's amazing how no one, it just kind of went under the radar for mainstream audiences and no one really picked it up, But there's a lot of camp in horror as well, which I think appeals to the queer community and LGBT people, and we can appreciate that. And I think the idea of, feeling ostracized or cursed, or like you're being chased by angry townspeople with burning torches. Like, I think that a lot of gay people can relate to that in a lot of ways.
Well, you mentioned being chased by people with torches. I mean, that goes all the way back to James Whale's Frankenstein in the 1930s.
Exactly. Or the Hunchback of Notre Dame, where they whip somebody in the city square for being different.
And explain what your film is about and give away as much or as little as you would like.
Sure. Well, the film is set in present-day Russia amidst the anti-gay attacks, the baited, catfish, targeted attacks that have been taking place there, where they bait young gay men online to come over for a hookup, and they're met by usually a group of people who then hurl homophobic and violent abuse at them and document it and then upload the videos online to further embarrass them and out them to their families and coworkers. So it was inspired by actual documented footage that had been uploaded online.
Классное местечко. Спасибо. Ты чай будешь? Пожалуйста. Какой тебе? Очень горячий.
I don't know if this is giving away too much, but your story kind of takes a turn in the sense of the person that you think is going to be the victim may not be quite so much the victim.
Yeah.
And is that partially also kind of a way for you to kind of take out some of your feelings about the way gays are often stereotyped and treated?
Yeah, I think being a member of the LGBT community, I feel like, and I've faced discrimination and abuse at the hands of homophobia before as well, but it still doesn't change that, I grew up to feel like I don't really feel like I feel empowered by being LGBT, and I don't feel like a victim, and I don't feel like standing down or letting that happen. I feel like standing up and being proud and persevering, and I feel like that fire within me is expressed through the film. It's the refusal to just sit down and take it. And
do you think horror gives you a very good way or an interesting way to attack that?
Absolutely. It allows you to talk about things in a subversive way and express things without the confines of reality, express them in an explosive, colorful, vibrant way, and make people think, and also put people in the shoes of the people that this is actually happening to, and terrify them so that maybe the audience will understand that this is something that is awful and it is terrifying, and kind of see it firsthand that way.
I'm wondering, do you get any pushback in the sense of, I know with like women filmmakers or female characters, sometimes you get this pushback of like, you should only be showing positive images. Like you shouldn't be showing anything negative.
Yeah.
And do you get that kind of pushback sometimes?
I have read that in like a comment here or there, or a review saying that, the person's personal taste thought that portraying gay people as monsters or as demons hurts that. But in fact, it was something that was very considered in the making of our film, and we're very aware of the fact that we're doing that. It's a kind of tongue-in-cheek nod to, if you think we're going to hell, if you think we're the devil, if we're the demons, then in this case, maybe we are just that. It's a little bit of like us sticking out our tongue and giving them just that and throwing it back at them. It was very thought through in that sense. The idea of feeling like you're cursed growing up and having a lycanthropic curse or anything like that in a film can be tied together in this case.
And where did you get the inspiration to do this particular story?
Through the real documented attacks, which can be seen online and that were uploaded around the time of the Olympics in 2014. That was the original inspiration for me writing Piotr.
And when you had seen those, did you feel that you wanted to kind of make some sort of statement about them, but not to necessarily do something that would be a documentary or an overt reaction to them?
I think I had felt very frustrated and angry by what I'd seen, and I wanted to imagine a situation where I could see these teenagers find their way out of a very hopeless situation, and realistically, there wasn't one. So the only way that they could find themselves out of that situation in those particular scenarios would be through something out of the realm of reality. So that's kind of how I went down that way.
And is horror something you've always been interested in, or did you choose this for this particular film?
No, horror has always been something I've been interested in, and I think as an artist, it's the voice I feel most comfortable speaking through. You know, it's something that I've been with since I was a child, when I used to look at my father's old black and white VHS tapes of classic Hollywood creatures like Dracula or Swamp Thing or Wolfman or Frankenstein or whoever. So I think it's kind of been, I watched a lot of Vincent Price and Elvira, Mistress of the Dark, so it's always kind of been ingrained in me.
This year, because there is this block of horror shorts here in San Diego at FilmOut, do you feel that there is something particular about films coming from gay filmmakers or about the LGBT community that are in horror films? Do you feel that there is something of a subgenre of gay horror, or would you prefer not to be like separated out like that?
You know what? I'm very happy to connect with people, gay horror fans in particular. You know, it's one of the nice things about being a filmmaker is you start to meet people who are like-minded, people who are passionate about the same things that you are and approach you because of what you brought to the table with your work. And you would never have met them otherwise, you know? So I definitely don't mind it being boiled down into like a subgenre. I think it actually really serves our work in a lot of ways because it brings forward the people that appreciate it in such a great way. But obviously I'd like it, and I think one of the great things about what we were able to do with this film is it does have a broader crossover. You know, we showed at Sitges and Fantasia and a lot of big horror, sci-fi, fantasy festivals, and we were able to reach an audience that normally wouldn't be exposed to queer subject matter or gay rights or anything like that, or even be challenged to think about that at a screening. So I think it's great when we can cross over and bring it into that realm as well.
I also work here in San Diego with a horror film festival called Horrible Imaginings, and we've had a sidebar on a couple of occasions where we call it Horror for Humanity, which is horror films that have some sort of social message. And sometimes, you know, because when I tell people like, oh, you should come to this horror festival, some people go like, oh, no, horror's not for me. But it seems like there's such a broad way to take horror, and that there does seem to be this whole kind of collection of horror films that do have a social context and do find a way to make comments about real issues.
Yes, I think there's horror can be an incredible vehicle to talk about things that are really happening in the world. You know, not everything is puppy dogs and daisies all the time, and there is a lot of nitty-gritty out there that's really happening, and I think horror has the guts to talk about it and address things in a very raw and like visceral way. And I think there is horror for everyone. I believe that as well. I think it's such a broad genre, and there's so many different types of horror. You know, there's camp. If you're not a fan of slashers and gore, you know, there's creature films, there's psychedelic horror. Like there's a huge spectrum to explore. So I'd like to believe that people can find something that they like within it.
And it also seems like when you are tackling issues or real things, that horror has a way of kind of slipping those in and getting to a different audience than if you made a film that was overtly a socially conscious movie.
Yeah, I think it frames it differently, you know. It frames it in a way that allows a viewer to maybe see it from a different perspective. You know, Night of the Living Dead, there's a lot of talk around how that was about race in America or the trauma after the war in Vietnam. And there's a lot of talk about The Exorcist and the religious aspect of it. And, you know, I think there's a lot of films that have a lot of substance that is kind of beyond just what you see at the surface.
Well, I want to thank you very much for making some time to talk to me about your film.
Oh, thanks. I appreciate you calling.
All right. Now I look forward to seeing another film from you in the horror genre.
Thanks. Yeah, I'll keep you posted.
That was Blake Mawson, director of Piotr 495. The only animated film in the horror block comes from Canadian filmmaker Daniel Sterling Altman, and it's called Hi, It's Your Mother. Here's his spoiler-free description.
It's a story about a woman who has a bit of an intense relationship with her mother. which you only really gather through a phone call.
Hi, Lisa. It's your mother, Martha. I don't like to nag, but it feels like you're hiding my grandson from me. So give me a call when you get this. Here's my phone number again. 463 555 3747.
So it's a story about a mother feeling affected by the overbearingness of her own mother, meanwhile trying to not be too involved in her son's life while he lives it right behind her.
And that doesn't quite get at the potential horror element in it, but there is a comic horror turn in this.
I think it is a bit hilarious that this film is a part of a horror section, because I think real horror fanatics would not classify this as a horror film, and it's certainly not. But there is blood, I guess, if that counts. Yeah, I do appreciate horror, and I don't think that I necessarily lace that into this film, but I guess it does have the sort of the gore that gives the shock value that you look for in a horror film.
I think so. I mean, it does have a comic element, but there's definitely, and it's I think it's the excess of it. There's a little excess of blood that I think pushes it into the horror genre. I mean, because if you take horror in a very broad sense, and in a broad and positive sense, I think it does fit into that genre.
Okay, that's good.
So what inspired you to make this film?
First and foremost, I wanted to make a queer animated short, because that sort of queer content doesn't really exist in the animation world that much, and particularly not in the short sections, and particularly not a coming out story or sort of a sad, anxious story. So I thought I would be able to have a unique angle of just having queer content in a film without it being such a central burden. And then with that, I sort of created scenarios that I thought would be fun to see on screen, including a couple having animated sex and a mother walking in on them.
And what is it about that format or that style that you enjoy working in?
I think there's something about stop motion that feels so real, but then it brings you back because it so clearly isn't. So I really like the tactile nature of it compared to CGI, like computer-generated things like Pixar things or 2D hand-drawn animation. I find that when you see stop motion, it's sort of, no matter what the content is, it becomes more lovable because you can sort of imagine it in your own hands. You can imagine what it feels like to touch. So I really appreciate that. And I also like the idea that so in my film I have a lot of realistic sets. So I put a lot of work into making very fine-tuned, detailed settings for the characters, but the puppets themselves are quite cartoony. And that contrast is just I just love watching it.
Now, you said that you don't really consider this horror exactly, but is that a genre that you would be interested in working in the future?
I wouldn't know enough about horror to say this, but I think I'm very drawn to the narrative. I think that's my priority, a good, intimate narrative. So I think if I can fit that into horror, I think it's sort of a fun way to maybe add a new facet that you wouldn't expect.
Well, it's just interesting because this year, because these films are all being grouped together in this horror block, being able to see them kind of all together back to back, I think points out an interesting way that some of these filmmakers are coming at horror and also at incorporating issues about growing up gay. And so I think it's a really fascinating block of films because of that. And I'm just curious if the genre kind of attracts you for dealing with those issues.
Well, I think what you're saying is interesting because it's so new to have queer content as anything but. Because I think initially queer content would just be specifically a melodrama or a tragedy. So it's exciting to see it, or even a comedy sort of almost tired out as just a pure comic relief. So I think it is really interesting to see horror approach the queer narrative. For me, I'm not sure if I think I would be more likely, like this time, to accidentally encounter horror as a product of my mind rather than a pure intention.
Are there any filmmakers or films that you see as an influence on you?
Yeah, I can't help but be influenced by other people in the stop motion medium. Adam Elliott, who's the filmmaker who created his most recent feature, was Marion Max. His work is a real inspiration. All of the touching, like how touching the stories are and how intimate they are, even though it is, I mean, I guess just as cartoony as mine are. Yeah, I think a lot of stop motion filmmakers, they sort of like take it to the next level. I think another example, Wes Anderson, even with Fantastic Mr. Fox, I find that he used the medium really beautifully to tell the same sort of intimate story that I would really love to be able to tell.
Well, I'm sorry you're not able to come to the festival and see some of the other films, but thank you very much for taking some time all the way from Australia to talk with me.
Thank you so much, Beth.
Daniel Sterling Altman's Hi, It's Your Mother is part of FilmOut's Fright Out Horror Short Films this year. Thanks for listening to another edition of listener-supported KPBS Cinema Junkie podcast. Coming up soon will be another TCM-centered podcast, this time focusing on Alfred Hitchcock and a new online class about the master of suspense. If you enjoy Cinema Junkie, please leave a review on iTunes or consider feeding the junkie with a donation at kpbs.org/feedthejunkie. Till our next Film Fix, I'm Beth Accomando, your resident Cinema Junkie.
KPBS On Demand is supported by Splatero, helping homeowners pay off debt by offering streamlined access to your home's equity with no additional monthly payments or new debt. Splatero provides a lump sum payment in exchange for a share of your home's future value. Pre-qualification is available at splatero.com.